The envelope was sitting on the kitchen counter when I got home, not propped up against anything, not left somewhere obvious like the dining table or my nightstand. Just sitting there, right next to the coffee maker, like it was a bill or a piece of junk mail. My wife, I'll call her Sandra, was standing by the sink with her back to me, washing a single glass even though the dishwasher was right there and completely empty. I knew something was wrong before I even touched it. "What's this?" I asked. She kept washing the glass. "You should open it." I was 43 years old. I'd been married to Sandra for 11 years. I knew the difference between her regular voice and the voice she used when she'd already made a decision and was just waiting for me to catch up. That was the second voice. I opened the envelope, divorce papers. I stood there in my work clothes. I'd just driven 40 minutes home from the architecture firm where I'd spent the last 9 years building something I was genuinely proud of, and I read through the first page, then the second. My name, her name, grounds, irreconcilable differences. A date I didn't recognize at first, then realized was 2 weeks from now. "You had these drawn up," I said. "Yes." "By a lawyer?" "Yes." I set the papers down on the counter, carefully, the same way you set down a glass that might be cracked and you're not sure yet how bad it is. "When did you decide this?" She finally turned around. And here's the thing about Sandra. She was beautiful, in that particular way that had always made me feel like I'd gotten lucky. Even then, standing in our kitchen, she looked composed. Not sad, not relieved. Composed. Like she was presenting a project at work and was confident in her findings. "I've been thinking about it for a while," she said. I asked her if there was someone else. She said that wasn't the point. I want to tell you I stayed calm. I want to say I nodded and said I'd have my lawyer look it over and we'd go from there like reasonable adults. Instead, I went upstairs, sat on the edge of our bed. Our bed, the one we'd bought together at a furniture store in Scottsdale after arguing for 45 minutes about whether a king was too big for the room, and I stared at the wall for a long time. I didn't cry. I'm not sure why. Maybe I was too tired. What I remember most from that night is going back downstairs around 10, and Sandra was on the couch watching TV, and I stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment and thought, I don't actually know what's happening here. Not really. I have the shape of it, but not the substance. I went back upstairs and called my brother, Walt. He picked up on the second ring. I said, "Sandra wants a divorce." There was a pause. Then he said, "You okay?" "I don't know yet," I said. Which was honest. Walt told me not to sign anything. Those were his exact words. "Don't sign a single thing until you've talked to someone who knows what they're doing. Promise me." I promised him. It was good advice. I would come to understand just how good in the weeks that followed. I took the papers to a lawyer named Harriet Voss. Walt recommended her. She'd handled his business partnership dispute 3 years earlier, and he said she was the kind of person who read everything twice and never got rattled. I sat across from her in her office on a Tuesday morning, and she read through the divorce filing the same way a doctor reads an X-ray, quietly, without expression, occasionally going back to check something earlier in the document. I watched her face for clues. When she finished, she looked up and said, "Tell me about your assets." So I did. The house, purchased 7 years ago, mortgage in both names. My business interest in the firm, which I was a junior partner in and had been building equity in for 4 years. Our joint investment accounts. My personal savings account, which I'd maintained separately since before we were married. She listened to all of it, then said, "And your wife, does she work?" Sandra was a senior manager at a commercial real estate company. Good salary. Better than good, actually. She'd been promoted twice in the last 3 years. Harriet made a note, then said something that changed the entire shape of what I thought was happening. "This filing is dated 6 weeks ago," she said. "What?" "The date of preparation. Your wife had these papers prepared 6 weeks ago. She's been holding them." I sat with that for a moment. 6 weeks. I tried to think back to 6 weeks ago. What had we been doing? Whether anything had felt different. I remembered a dinner where she'd been quiet, but she was often quiet. I remembered a weekend where she'd gone to visit her sister in Tucson and I'd stayed home to finish a project deadline. I remembered thinking she seemed a little distant when she got back, but assuming she was tired from the drive. 6 weeks. Why would someone hold on to divorce papers for 6 weeks? I asked. Harriet looked at me carefully. Sometimes people use that window to restructure things. I asked her what she meant by restructure. She said, I'd like to pull your joint financial records before we go any further. What Harriet found took 10 days to piece together and about 15 minutes to explain, and I remember sitting in her office listening to her lay it out and feeling the strange, specific sensation of the floor dropping out from under you while you're still sitting perfectly still in a chair. In the 6 weeks between when Sandra had the papers prepared and when she handed them to me, approximately $340,000 had moved out of our joint investment portfolio. Not all at once. In transfers of varying amounts to accounts I wasn't familiar with. Some of it had been repositioned into assets held solely in Sandra's name. Some of it had gone somewhere Harriet was still tracing. She was repositioning herself before the filing, Harriet said, before you knew anything was happening. I asked if that was legal. It's marital misconduct. In Arizona, a judge can factor that into asset division. But we need documentation of everything, and we need to act quickly. I want to tell you I was angry in that moment. And I was, but it was a cold kind of angry, not the hot kind. Not the kind where you want to throw something or say something you'll regret. More like the kind where you sit very still and think, okay, now I understand what this actually is. This wasn't Sandra deciding she was unhappy and wanting out of a marriage that wasn't working anymore. This was Sandra deciding she was unhappy, making a plan, executing the first phase of that plan, and then handing me the papers once she felt she'd positioned herself well enough. I thought about how she'd looked standing at the sink washing that glass. Composed. Yeah, composed was right. I told Harriet to do whatever she needed to do. She said she needed authorization to access records, and she needed me to not have any significant conversations with Sandra about finances until we had a clearer picture. Don't let on that you know, she said. Can you do that? I told her I could. I drove home that evening and Sandra was in the kitchen making pasta and she said, "How was your day?" And I said, "Long, but fine." And we ate dinner together at the table we'd had for 9 years, and I asked her about her project in Mesa and she told me about a zoning issue they were navigating and I nodded and said that sounded frustrating. I was thinking about $340,000. My business partner at the firm was a man named Curtis. We'd worked together for 6 years and I trusted him the way you trust someone you've been through difficult things with. Professionally. Not blind trust, but the earned kind. I told him, in general terms, that I was going through a divorce and that there were some questions about my equity stake and whether there was anything I should be doing to protect my position. Curtis looked at me for a long moment and then said, "I had a feeling something was going on with you." I hadn't realized I'd been that transparent. He referred me to the firm's corporate attorney, a man named Gerald Park, who specialized in partnership and equity law. Gerald and Harriet talked, which I'd asked them to do. Between the two of them, they determined that Sandra's attorney, whoever she'd hired, had been quietly investigating my equity stake in the firm as a marital asset that could be divided. That's when I understood the full shape of it. The house, the investment accounts. Those were one layer. But Sandra, or whoever was advising her, had identified my equity in the firm as the real prize. I'd been building that position for 4 years. It was worth considerably more than the house. If a judge divided it as a marital asset, I was looking at losing a significant portion of something I'd poured my professional life into. Gerald said, "There are things we can do, but we need to move." I said, "Then let's move." What followed was 3 weeks of very careful, very quiet work on my side. I'm not going to go into all the legal specifics because honestly, I didn't understand all of it myself. I signed things Gerald put in front of me and trusted him when he explained what they meant, and I asked questions when I didn't follow something. What I will say is that there are legitimate structures through which a business interest can be reorganized in ways that are legally sound and that affect how a court evaluates them in a dissolution proceeding. Gerald knew all of them. Meanwhile, Harriet was building her documentation on the financial transfers. She found something Harriet actually called me about on a Friday afternoon, and I could tell from her tone that it was significant. "The money that we couldn't trace," she said, "we found it. Some of it had gone into a joint account held by Sandra and a man named Paul Whitfield. I didn't know that name. I looked him up that evening and found his LinkedIn. He was in commercial real estate, same industry as Sandra. I looked at his photo for a long time. He was younger than me, nice enough looking, the kind of guy who coaches youth soccer on weekends based on the profile. I felt something then that wasn't quite anger. It was more like a door closing. Harriet said there was more. Whitfield had recently had some financial problems, a venture that had gone sideways, some creditors. The money from Sandra's transfers appeared to be helping him restructure those debts, which meant Sandra hadn't just been moving money away from our marriage. She'd been moving it toward him, toward his problems. She'd been cleaning up a mess that wasn't hers to clean. I sat in my car in the parking garage at work the next morning for about 10 minutes before going inside. Just sitting there, engine off, thinking about 11 years, thinking about the furniture store in Scottsdale, and the argument about the king bed and how I'd eventually said, "Fine, you win, let's get the king," and we laughed about it the whole drive home. Thinking about a vacation we'd taken to Portland 4 years ago where it rained every single day and we'd found this tiny bar that made incredible cocktails and we'd gone back 3 nights in a row. Thinking about all the ordinary specific texture of a life with someone. Then I went inside and had a normal day at work. I want to pause here and say something because I think it matters. There's a version of this story where I'm the wronged hero and Sandra is the villain and everything is black and white. I don't think that's entirely true. I think our marriage had been struggling for a long time in ways I'd been telling myself weren't that serious. I worked too much. I know that. I was present physically and absent in other ways that are harder to name. I don't think that justifies what Sandra did, the planning, the financial maneuvering, the other person. But I also don't think I'm blameless in how we got to a kitchen counter with an envelope on it. I'm telling you this because I think it's the honest version, the mistake Sandra made, and it was a significant mistake, was assuming I would be passive. That I would get the papers, be blindsided, and spend the next 6 months too hurt and confused to pay attention to the details. Maybe that's who she thought I was. Maybe that's who I'd been in certain ways for a long time. She was about to find out I wasn't that person anymore. 6 weeks after Sandra handed me the envelope, Harriet filed a response to her divorce petition that included a motion for financial disclosure and a preliminary injunction freezing further asset transfers. Sandra's attorney apparently called Harriet within the hour. Harriet told me this with the closest thing to satisfaction I'd seen from her. 3 days later, I came home to find Sandra sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her, not doing anything, just sitting there. "Your lawyer filed something," she said. "Yes," I said. "You knew about the accounts." "Yes." She looked at me for a long moment. I noticed she was wearing the watch I'd given her for our 10th anniversary. I wondered if she put it on deliberately or just hadn't thought about it. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "that I wasn't trying to—" "Sandra," I said it quietly, not harshly. "I'm not going to have this conversation with you. That's what lawyers are for." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long have you known?" "Long enough." I went upstairs and changed my clothes and came back down and made dinner. We ate in a silence that was different from all the other silences we'd had over 11 years. Those had been the silences of 2 people running out of things to say to each other. This was the silence of 2 people who understood exactly where they stood. The mediation took 4 sessions. Sandra's attorney came in the first session clearly expecting that I'd be on the defensive, that their financial positioning gave them leverage, that I'd be scrambling. Instead, Harriet laid out our documentation, the transfer records, the Whitfield connection, all of it in a very matter-of-fact way, like she was presenting quarterly earnings. I watched Sandra's attorney's face as she read through it. The expression that passed over it was the closest thing to satisfaction I allowed myself. We reached a settlement that I'm not able to discuss in detail. What I can say is that I kept my equity position in the firm. I kept the savings I'd had since before we were married. The asset division was, ultimately, fair, not tilted in my favor the way I might have felt entitled to after everything, but fair, equitable. Which is, I believe, what it was supposed to be. Paul Whitfield, I heard through someone who knew someone in their industry, had some additional financial problems that surfaced around that time. I don't know the details. I didn't ask. Sandra moved into an apartment in Central Phoenix. I stayed in the house for 4 months and then sold it, because being in it alone was exactly as hard as I'd thought it would be and harder. I bought a smaller place closer to the office, a condo with a second bedroom I use as a drafting space. The kitchen counter is always clear when I come home. It's been 14 months since any of this happened. I want to tell you I have a neat ending, that I met someone, or that I've done some profound personal growth, or that I look back now and see clearly all the lessons I was supposed to learn. Mostly what I have is this. I know things about myself now that I didn't know before. I know that I'm more capable of paying attention than I'd been giving myself credit for. I know that I have a tendency to avoid conflict until it's unavoidable, and I'm working on that. I know that Walt will always pick up on the second ring, which is not a small thing. I go to Portland sometimes, alone, and I sit in bars and have cocktails and remember what it was like to be happy there with someone. I don't think that's sad, exactly. I think it's just the texture of a life that has more than one chapter in it. The firm is doing well. Curtis and I just brought on a third partner, a woman named Adele, who is going to be exceptional. I'm working on a project right now, a community center in Tempe, that I think is genuinely the best work I've ever done. I get up early and make coffee and stand at my kitchen window and think about the day ahead, and most mornings that's enough. I'm not angry at Sandra anymore. I was, for a while. Then I got to a place where what I felt was more like a kind of grief. For the marriage, for the version of us that had existed before things went wrong, for the furniture store in Scottsdale, and the bar in Portland, and the accumulated small moments of a life together. Grief is different from anger. It has an end to it, or at least a softening. What I will tell you, and this is the part I want you to actually hear if you're going through something similar, is this. Don't be passive. Not out of revenge, not out of spite, but because you deserve to know what's actually happening. You deserve to be awake in your own life, even when being awake is painful. Especially then. I almost signed those papers without talking to anyone. I almost let the version of events that Sandra had decided on become the only version. I almost let the floor drop out from under me without ever understanding why. Walt said don't sign anything. I didn't. That's the whole story. Or at least as much of it as I know how to tell. I've thought a lot about what actually went wrong, not with Sandra specifically, but with me, and the version of myself I'd become inside that marriage. I was someone who avoided hard conversations. I told myself that was patience, or maturity, or keeping the peace, but there's a difference between being patient and being absent. I was absent in ways that had nothing to do with where my body was. I was there at the dinner table and gone at the same time, and I think some part of Sandra had felt that for years before she ever picked up the phone to call a lawyer. That doesn't make what she did right. The planning, the transfers, the 6 weeks of quiet maneuvering while I went to work and came home and thought everything was just fine. That was a choice she made, and choices have weight. They move things. They set other things in motion that can't be stopped once they've started. Sandra made a series of choices, assuming I was someone who would absorb whatever happened and not push back. She'd built her entire plan on that assumption, and she wasn't entirely wrong about who I'd been. She was just wrong about who I was going to be. What I know now is that intelligence without honesty is just cleverness. And cleverness in service of avoiding truth will eventually cost you more than the truth ever would have. Sandra was clever. The financial moves, the timing, the way she stood at that sink looking composed, all of it was clever. But none of it was honest, and the moment Harriet laid those transfer records on the table, all that cleverness collapsed into something that couldn't be defended. Walt told me not to sign anything. That was the first act of paying attention. Everything after that, Harriet, Gerald, the work we did quietly over those 3 weeks, was just what happens when you decide to be awake in your own life, instead of sleepwalking through it. I don't think of it as revenge. Revenge would have required me to want Sandra to suffer. I didn't want that. I wanted what was fair. I wanted to understand what was actually happening before I agreed to it. That's not revenge. That's just self-respect. There's something I believe now that I didn't fully understand before all this. The quality of your life is determined almost entirely by the quality of your attention, not your intelligence, not your ambition, not how hard you work, your attention, what you actually notice, what you allow yourself to see when seeing it is uncomfortable. I had turned my attention away from my marriage for years. I had turned it away from things Sandra was doing that if I'm honest, had small signs I chose not to read. That inattention cost me, not as much as it could have, because Walt answered on the second ring and Harriet read everything twice. But it cost me time and certainty and a version of the future I thought I was building. The condo I live in now is quiet in the mornings. There's nobody else's schedule pulling at mine. I make coffee and stand at the window and I think about what I'm going to do that day, and most days that's enough. That's not a sad ending. It's just an honest one. You don't get to choose most of what happens to you, but you get to choose how awake you are when it does.